Are you actually behind or just held to a higher standard? It's taking longer because it's bigger than you. That is my new personal essay. And I thought, you know what? Let me try out a new format and not just read the essay, but also annotate it as I was thinking through and writing this personal piece. If you're new here, I'm Shay. I'm a PhD candidate at Harvard, as well as your chief critical thinking officer. And I try my best to write at least one personal essay per quarter. And that's what I have this quarter. So, yeah, let's get into it. So, periodically, I will pause to like give additional thoughts, but it might be helpful to have the essay open with you um, as I'm reading. Okay, so your calling is greater than your time frame. And I hope to convince you by the end of this essay not to give up on that thing you've been working on that feels like it's been taking forever. We're going to go deep and then come up for a breath of fresh air at the end. Okay, so for this section, um, what I've noticed with especially personal essays these days that are in the form of newsletter, you almost want to give people an expectation. Like, like, why should you read towards the end? If you give me your attention for 5, 6, 7, 8 minutes, however long it takes you to read this essay, what's going to be the payoff, right? As opposed to people who come to, I don't know, like the New Yorker or like other formats for essays where it's like this expectation that you are exploring this writer and this piece of writing for the first time and you don't know what to expect, but this is a literary format, so there's more buy-in into this, and personal essays are not like my primary form of communication through my newsletter. So yeah, I just love to give people like a heads up, like, hey, this is not a full-blown trigger warning, but hey, we're gonna go deep. It might get a little too deep for some, but then we'll come back up for fresh air. Because I don't know, I love to end my voice notes as well as my newsletters on a positive note, because I think there's a lot of doom and gloom out there. Um, and yeah, it's never too much to inject some hope into situations, right? Okay, back to the essay. Also, this photo I chose, I went through so many um like copyright free platforms like the National Gallery of Art and like other amazing archives and museums that provide copyright free material for you to use. And I just love this piece by Redon. Melancholy 1876. It was so vibrant. It was so, despite it being obviously about sadness and that deep reflection, as you will tell in this essay. But then just the beautiful gold and blues and the radiance emanating from this person sitting on this piece of rock, knowing that that hill is right behind you, you know. There were just so many beautiful metaphors in it. So I ended up going with this. I was looking at I think a Picasso piece at one point, and then I was looking at some Renaissance paintings. But this one ended up being like the perfect piece for this essay. Back to the essay. It took the Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Isabel Wilkerson 15 years to write The Warmth of Other Suns. The book opens up with such an immersive vignette that you'll immediately understand why it shot to the top of the New York Times bestseller list. And I read, the night clouds were closing in on the salt licks east of the Oxbow Licks, along the folds in the earth beyond the Yallabusha River. The cotton was at last cleared from the field. Ida May tried now to get the children ready and to gather the clothes and quilts and somehow keep her mind off the churning within her. She had sold off the turkeys and doled out in secret the old stools, the washpots, the tin tub, the bed pallets. Her husband was settling with Mr. Ed over the worth of a year's labor, and she did not know what would come of it. None of them had been on a train before, not unless you counted the clattering local from Bacon Switch to Okolona, where by the time you sit down, you're there. As Ina May put it, none of them had been out of Mississippi or Chickasaw County for that matter. And that's from page 1 of The Warmth of Other Suns. Years of research, oral history interviews, drafting, contemplating, drafting again. We don't know how many times she may have written this opening passage or what details might have been removed during the editing process. And if you're somehow reading this, Isabel, please send me a message. Nonetheless, this book has become an essential member of my reference library for good writing. That churning within her was what I felt this past week. What started off as the familiar, nauseating feeling that anxiety bestows on the body, my gut churning like it was making butter from the milk contained in the numerous ice matchas I had last week, turned into a sharp pain. Of course, it's the week with 1,000,001 deadlines that the crippling fiery darts start to attack. Here's the thing about this particular kind of pain. It's unpredictable. So I've learned to write around it, working in frantic bursts, not sure when the ache would strike again. In many ways, that's always been a source of pride for me, working through pain. Though this week was different, the physical pain got compounded by mental anguish. Okay, so I went to stop again for commentary. So for this section, I loved the metaphor of the churning within her, because for anyone who has suffered a panic attack or you experience anxiety or things of that sort, you sort of know what it's like for like butterflies to be unleashed in your stomach. You know what I mean? It's like almost like, like zombie butterflies. They just are like rah 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 in your stomach, right? And ironically enough, this past week I was like, you know what? I've been meaning to try this really fancy like French butter at M&S. If you're in London, you know what I'm talking about. The small luxuries in life, right? Not buying a home, but can afford fancy French butter. And then when you look at the back of the label, it talks about the churning process. Um, and yeah, I just had that image of all of the different iced matchas I had this week and the amount of milk that's in them. I mean, because when you think about it, the shot of matcha that you put in it is quite small relative to the amount of milk that you used. And just thinking of that churning process, which is why when I revisited Isabel Wickerson's work this past week, that specific line stood out to me. And I think for anyone who's experienced any form of like pain, um, I thought of, and I was actually writing this in on Sunday, this past Sunday, and finishing up the touches on it, and I just thought about the fiery darts of the enemy, like all my old school saints who's been in any form of the black church TM, or, no matter where you are in the world, we always talk about the fiery darts of the enemy. And a lot of it is like the unexpectedness of it, and I talk about the unpredictability of it. So for my churchy folks, you'll understand the fiery darts. That's a familiar language, to many of us. Okay, let's continue with the essay. Earlier this year, I wrote a personal essay about my goal of collecting 1,000 rejections. Maybe it's the marathon of doing a PhD or just getting older, but I felt like I had lost my spark last year. In my college years, I didn't really doubt myself. I had this persistent work ethic motivated by the idea that the number of no's didn't really matter. All I needed was one yes. I ate rejection for breakfast. Then I was thrust into life in your 20s, where you can only handle but so much uncertainty as your safety net dwindles like sand through your fingers. I lived in more countries than I thought was possible in my 20s. Aging out of Obamacare, I found my appetite for big risks diminishing. And then I started to doctor it. There are no quick wins. It's a marathon. What I've learned from friends who have actually run a marathon is that there's a part in the middle where you grow complacent with your pace. No faster, no slower. You're doing what you need to do to make the time you decided for yourself when you started the race. Last year, I became aware of my complacency. So I revved up my appetite for risk taking and looked for rejections. I started applying for as many things, seeking out new opportunities, and making bolder business decisions. The only thing is, it's halfway through 2026, and now I have to abandon my rejection goal. People kept saying yes, and yes, and yes, and now my cup is running over. For example, I sent a DM to Grace Beverly earlier this year after she liked one of my Instagram reels to ask if I could talk about critical thinking on her podcast. A version of me last year would have talked myself out of it. I can't speak to her demographic. I'm too boring. I'm not going to be able to spread the message about the importance of preserving human intelligence, yada, yada, yada. Yet, to my utter surprise, she had already been looking for someone to cover that exact topic on the podcast. So many of you are here today because of that podcast episode. And I want to take an aside in this story to say I hope those who followed my journey are encouraged to keep on knocking on doors because you'll never know which ones have been slightly ajar, waiting for you to walk through them. Okay, some more commentary on this section. So when you're writing an essay, you want it to sing. You want it to have a certain beat and a certain cadence to it. And I tend to write really long run-on sentences, but for this one, I want to pick the pace up a little bit more. At one point, I was like, "Oh man, I'm using the word dwindle a lot." So I was like, "Is there another word that starts with a D that helps me paint the picture of life in my 20s and how quick it went by?" I mean, I miss my 20s. It was very quick. Um, Without constantly like using the word. So then I ended up going with diminishing instead of dwindling. And there was also a part of me where, I was trying to really articulate what it's like to not only discover your complacency, but to actually want to do something about it, right? Um, And I've shared this story before about like reaching out to Grace Beverly and some other decisions I made on my road to collecting 1,000 rejections. But I think in many ways, like, you want to add sort of a point of faster pace for people who are, moving through the slog of what I started with, which is a very long quoted passage, which I know is like for a lot of essayists, they're like, don't do that. You're gonna you're gonna make people like zone out because they automatically skip over that long quote. And then you've basically lost them for the essay. I disagree. I don't know. I feel like Isabel Wilkerson's writing is just so majestic that it's worth reading in slow motion. Which is better because the first draft of this, I actually started off with my three examples. So I went Isabel Wilkerson, 15 years, um, uh, Toni Morrison, 5 years, Michelangelo, 4 years. It was like boom, 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 boom. But then I was like, nah, we got to spread this joint out because for a lot of the different points I wanted to make, I didn't want to have to keep bouncing back and forth between those examples. So I just wanted to run a little bit more smoothly. Okay, let's continue with the essay. Back to the pain. So I have pain shooting through my body at random times throughout the day, and then I'm in a constant state of mental anguish. All of the yeses, while blessings, started to become burdensome. So while overwhelmed, I also became frustrated with myself for not being able to bear the load like normal. My thoughts became clouded with things like, oh, why is this dissertation taking so long? So many of my peers have already graduated. Why am I struggling to find the words for this essay? Has my mind turned into mush? I should have stood my ground more in that meeting. This project is way too precious to let it get watered down by people stuck in the realm of only what's possible. When I got critical feedback on an essay, I wanted to ball it up and throw it out my window. At a certain point, the pain, both mental and physical, became too much. And I had to take a pause. This isn't something I can simply plow through. Let's pause for another quick commentary. So, for anyone who's ever experienced migraines, um, the cloudiness of it all, right? Like when I wanted to share some of the excerpts of my thoughts that were literally like, what I imagined here is like, sort of when you start to lose vision from so much pain, and it's like, yeah, cloudiness. It starts to get very gray and blurry, and you're just like unable to see. Um, that's how intrusive the thoughts were. Right. So it would have been easy to just be like, oh my gosh, look at all these intrusive thoughts. But it's like, you almost want to create that imagery of familiarity for people who have experienced the kind of pain that I went through last week. Just as another touch point for this essay. Like, like you want to write something visceral, but at the same time, you don't want to, over explain it for people. Like you want for those who have had that experience to feel seen. So that's how I was thinking through that. All right, let's continue. It took Toni Morrison 5 years to write her first novel, The Bluest Eye. In a 1998 interview with Mavis Nicholson, Morrison says it took forever because it had no real reason for being done beyond her own reading pleasure. She was a picky reader, and she wanted to write a book she had never read before. In other words, she held herself to a high standard. When you hold yourself to such a standard, you can often experience this mental anguish I've been describing. You're not striving for perfection per se, you're striving for the limits of your own potential. And sometimes you're held to a different standard, not always a bigger or higher one. It's all relative. I don't want the importance of your own calling to be taken for granted merely because of its size. So when I read that piece of feedback this week, I felt like I was being held to a different standard. Surely this piece was good enough to be accepted, until we had a conversation about the writing, and I was relieved to be right. I was being held to a different standard, but that was because this person knows what I'm capable of and also shares the vision for my future. This is why I always say it's important who you take feedback from. Does the person critiquing you have your very best in mind? So while yes, the particular piece of writing would have been okay as is, this person is ripping into the piece because the standard is both different from the rest and higher than the standard I was holding for myself. Okay, so pausing for commentary. This Toni Morrison interview came in clutch. So I've been reading and watching, a lot of old interviews for people that are helping me with this critical thinking curriculum that I've been working on, right? And there's so much wisdom in the past. And oftentimes, like, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Like, there are so many amazing thinkers. I oftentimes want to examine other people's writing processes. So when I found this Toni Morrison interview, I was like, oh my gosh, yes. She really encapsulated what it means to hold yourself to such a high standard, right? And oftentimes, like, the measuring stick is usually yourself. Like, like it's never helpful to constantly look to your left and to your right and say like, oh my gosh, like, I have to meet the standard of other people. Not necessarily all the time, but I think there's a beauty in saying like, I am a picky reader. You know what I mean? Like, I want to read. That's how I felt about this essay. I was like, if I was going through the valley of despair that I went through, what essay would have gotten me out of it? What essay would have been like, girl, get up, i.e. Sarah Jakes Roberts. Like, you know what I mean? Like, what would have gotten me out of my slump, right? Other than addressing the pain, obviously. Please get help if you are experiencing the kind of pain that I was talking about. So yeah, that's the beauty of this section, where I really just wanted to use the Toni Morrison example as a way of speaking to the high functioning, high achievers. Like, like the people who are so used to working through the pain, and the people who hold themselves in high regard, and the people that know they want to create something different or something that's never been done before, right? Like, how could we use Toni Morrison's words to articulate that specific feeling, right? Okay, let's get back into it. This is the major takeaway. Whether you're skimming or you've been reading all the way through, sometimes the project will take longer because your calling is bigger than just this one project. Your calling is bigger than the time you set in the beginning before knowing what role this project is supposed to play in your future. In the realm of creative production, the project often sets the pace. This is what makes us distinct from machines. We can't always produce passable polish on demand. Sorry, pausing for another quick commentary. I was obsessed with peas in this paragraph. I have no idea why, but I just wanted to add, like, I don't know, like, you know how you obviously can't see me right now, but for microphones, there's this black covering that's supposed to prevent like a huge popping sound when I use anything with the letter P or anything, that requires that type of sounds like pop, 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 right? When I was reading this specific passage out loud, I was like, oh, I don't know. Like there's, I like, it's almost like a paragraph level alliteration that I wanted, right? So, your calling is bigger than the time you set in the beginning before you know the role that this project is supposed to play in your future. In the realm of creative production, the project often sets the pace. This makes this distinct from machines. We can't always produce passable polish. Oh, I'm sorry. When I read that out loud, I was like, bam, shade. That's it, right? Like there was I used to really be into slam poetry when I was in high school. I had a wonderful English teacher that really got me into Def Jam poetry, which is a story for another day. And yeah, there was just something about the melodic nature. Like, I mean, a lot of writers know this. When you hit the melodic beat of an essay when you're reading it out loud and you're just like, yes, I did that finally. Okay. And then I include a screenshot of a thread by Colin, who's an amazing creator. You should follow him on Instagram and Threads. And it was just the perfect culmination of all the wrestling I was doing this past week. His thread reads, "It's taking longer because your calling is greater." And then, in my little churchy dance meme, I'm like, glory. Like, yes, this is exactly what I had to learn this week. Back to the essay. So while I might be frustrated that things are taking longer than intended, it would be foolish of me to even put a time frame on it. Toni Morrison was in her 30s when she wrote her first novel, but she died late into her 80s. What does it matter how long a project takes to complete when you don't even know how many heartbeats you have left on this earth? What is 5 years in an 88-year lifespan? A person could write a novel in 8 months and die 2 years later. The person who finished their PhD in 3 years could be on the academic job market for the next 7 years. Nobody knows what's waiting for them at the end of their big project or what its intended purpose is in this big, beautiful, yet deformed frame called life. A done dissertation is not a good dissertation in my world. A done proposal that's mediocre doesn't cut it. A functional product with minor bugs is actually major. The standard is different. Every day I have to resist the urge to want speed over depth. Because at the end of the day, good things often just take a good amount of time. Another quick commentary. So for that line where I'm like, what its intended purposes in this big, beautiful, yet deformed frame called life. Originally I just wrote a big, beautiful life, right? But then I was like, almost had like, I don't know if you've read The Picture of Dorian Gray, but like this idea that life in itself can sometimes be grotesque. Like, you know what I mean? Because I'm like, oh my gosh, like, look at what I just wrote. Like, you could literally write a novel in 8 months and then die 2 years later. Like, that's the unpredictability, the grotesqueness of life. Like, yes, life is beautiful, but it also has grotesqueness to it. But I didn't want to use the word grotesque, right? Because if I'm talking about the metaphor of life being like a frame, you almost want to see it as, almost like a deformed frame. Like, you know what I mean? You have this picture that you envision in your life, and it doesn't always go to plan. And there are parts of it that are beautiful. And oftentimes we think of the frame as being beautiful, but what happens when the frame is like actually deformed and it's trying to hold that beautiful vision that we have, right? So that's what I was thinking about in terms of that imagery. And then, yeah, I'm sorry, the whole done dissertation is a good dissertation. I was like, let's flip that on its head and provide multiple examples of this different standard that I'm constantly talking about. Like, you want to add um more examples than just mine, right? Because obviously you want the personal essay to resonate with people from across the spectrum, from different industries, right? So that's why I included more things. And then one small note towards the end of that section, I was like, oh man, good things often take a lot of time. But then I was like, no, like let's throw some more alliteration there. Good things often take a good amount of time. Because when you're reading your work out loud, you're like, how would I say it as I'm talking to a friend? Like, you know what I mean? I would add in an extra good, so I added that there. All right, let's continue. As AI encroaches more and more on every aspect of our lives, what's growing underneath is a new renaissance. A generation of creatives, artists, writers, and humanists is thrusting themselves into the depths of their creative process, choosing to do the hard things that mastery requires. A Renaissance mindset requires versatility and flexibility, but it also requires patience. The Sistine Chapel took Michelangelo 4 years and a whole lot of pain. Now, this is not to say that pain is necessarily a requirement for greatness, but rather familiarity with difficulty. If you're experiencing the kind of pain I described, please don't wait as I did. Get help. The work was slow as Michelangelo was a sculptor learning a new medium. He reflected on his experience in a poem to a friend. A goiter, it seems, I got from this backward craning, like the cats get there in Lombardy, or wherever bad water they save from lapping their fetid river. My belly tugged under my chin, Zol of whack. Beard points like a finger at heaven near the back of my neck. Skull scrapes where a hunchback's hump would be. I'm pigeon breasted, a harpy. Face dribbled, see? Like a Byzantine floor mosaic. From all this straining, my guts and my ham bones tangle pretty near. Thank God I can swivel my buttocks around for ballast. Feet are out of sight, they just scuffle round erratic. Up front, my hide's tight elastic. In the rear, it's slack and droopy, except where crimps have calloused. I'm bent like a bow, half round, type Asiatic. Not odd, that's what's on my mind. When express comes out of weird, jumbled. Don't berate. No gun with its barrel screwy can shoot straight. Giovanni, come agitate. For my pride, my poor dead art, I don't belong. Who's a painter? Me? No way. They've got me wrong. That's Michelangelo Paints the Ceiling, translated by Frederick Nims. When you reach that valley of despair, like I did this past week, don't question your calling like Michelangelo. Who's a painter? Me? No way. They've got me wrong. Don't throw away the painting, delete the draft, or erase the track. It's taking longer because the kind of impact you're trying to make in your industry requires you to be held to a different standard. Because, let's also be honest, standards seem to have been slipping across the board. Be encouraged, beloveds. I love that word, beloved. I mean, I think part of it's because Beloved is one of my favorite Toni Morrison books. But yeah, I mean, I wanted to end lol. Sorry, I wanted to end the essay on a more positive note because the Michelangelo example is actually quite beautiful because we all have that point where we really question, like, am I who I say I am? Am I living up to the titles I give to myself? Am I, constantly exercising the function of that title? Right. And that valley of despair, whether, you're doing it in pain or not, is such a familiar human experience. Right. And part of me also wanted to add the note about, greatness doesn't necessarily require pain, but familiarity with difficulty. Because, come on now, I think some of us overglorify suffering, especially many of us that live in the West. Because I think part of it is suffering is seen as a form of acquiring righteousness. of acquiring a sort of like sainthood, right? And I don't think, pain, as what is oftentimes associated with artistry or genius or things of that sort, has to be a requirement. I don't, it doesn't have to be. And that's why I was like, look, if you're experiencing the kind of pain I'm experiencing, please go get that checked out. Don't wade through it. There's certain kinds of pain where, there's the familiar pain. And then there's the pain where it's like, oh, this is, hmm, this needs to be checked out. Right. So, what I'm trying to encourage more so is familiarity with difficulty, which doesn't require for it to be a painful experience. So, yeah, that is my essay. Thank you so much for listening. I, wanted to try out this new format, and I'm always talking about the importance of documenting your process and just sharing, your unique way of seeing the world. So, if you liked this kind of episode, please let me know. Comment below. Make sure you subscribe wherever you are listening to, and I will talk to you in the next voice note.